Hello, and welcome to the 5 Core Life podcast with Will Moore, founder of More Momentum. Today's episode, we were talking about how to stay physically fit and to gamify your fitness habits so that you stay on track towards your fitness and health goals. Will sits down with Zach Bitter, who is an endurance athlete, world-class endurance athlete, and talks about his own experience of when to push through the pain, when to quit, and how to balance the psychological aspect as well as the physical aspect of enduring through pain. If you haven't already, go ahead and pound that subscribe button so you get notified when episodes air every week. Are you ready to fire on all cylinders? If so, let's go.
Hey, how's it going? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, glad to have you on, man. How are you?
Awesome. Well, thanks a bunch for welcoming me on.
Oh, absolutely. So I was saying at the beginning, you're doing something. I love how every human's different. We all have our superpowers. Running for me is like not my superpower. It's one of those things that I feel like I was not born with, the ability, the will, the drive, whatever you want to call it, to run. My wife is the exact opposite. She ran in high school. She's done marathons. She's done triathlons. Like, she's the real deal. Loves it. She goes for runs. She just ran this morning. So I love talking. I love seeing different perspectives and talking to people that are in certain things. And it's just a reminder, like, to the world, like, we all have natural inclinations, abilities, strengths, passions to do certain things. And when you're looking to exercise and get your body moving, you want to gravitate towards those. Like, don't force yourself to run if you don't like running, and don't force yourself to go to the gym if you hate lifting weights. Figure out creative ways that you actually enjoy to reduce the friction. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think you hit it right on the head. One of the things I'll ask my coaching clients or folks who reach out to me that want to get into running is I ask them why, because we live in an interesting time in the sense that there's tons of great ways to move your body and get into shape and get fit, and running is just one of them. And it tends to be kind of available. So I think sometimes people will gravitate toward, or it's something that they can wrap their head around starting up or doing on their own. So it does have that kind of welcoming type of barrier to entry, I guess we can call it. But ultimately, I think you're right. Like, if you're going to be spending that time, you may as well be doing something you enjoy. So if that's getting in the weight room and working on like strength and power related stuff, or playing pickup basketball or something like that, build your fitness around things that you're going to enjoy, because that's what's going to make it sustainable. There's always that big question. I think this rolls over into things like nutrition as well. It's like, that's great if it's going to work on paper, if it's going to do the things you want to do on paper, but how does it actually translate into your life, and what else are you going to gain from it outside of just going through the motions?
That's exactly right. And right, it's not just nutrition, it's like all areas of your life, and it ties to kind of, right, that like reducing friction of like, don't fight upstream if you don't have to. Like, like, figure out things. Like, everybody's unique and different, and we all have, our different taste buds. So like, one of the things I tell people is, if you're a midnight snacker, like, don't, rather than saying, I need to not snack, because you're eating cookies and ice cream or whatever it is, and then you're depriving yourself, and then you're using willpower, which will eventually break down. Instead, you replace that failure habit, whatever that thing is that you were eating that wasn't doing you any good, with something that is tasty to you, right? And we all have these different taste buds, and now there's no excuse, really. I mean, depending on what part of the world, but if you're in an area that has populous and has lots of grocery stores and you can order stuff within usually an hour to be at your door, there's plenty of stuff that tastes good and is going to be good for you. You just got to keep trying and finding those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, right on. It's interesting too, because I think like people do tend to gravitate towards what they're good at as well when it comes to fitness, I think. So another thing I usually recommend is just trying a variety of things. Don't be afraid to try something out you haven't done before, because maybe you'll find that you like it, enjoy it. And starting from the beginning can be daunting for people, but sometimes it's also a real fun time to get into some sort of fitness, because you just see a lot of progress early on then when you're starting kind of from the beginning. And I'll think about that even within the sport that I do of ultra marathon running. I mean, it's a lot of running no matter which event you do, but there is a super wide variety of different things. You can go up and do mountain courses that are above 10,000 feet. You can run flat loops, all sorts of different stuff. So whenever I start finding that either getting really kind of polished in one area and it's making it kind of hard to be motivated to go out and do the same workouts again, then sometimes it's time to just take a season or a race or something and pick something completely different so that you kind of have that experience again of like, okay, we're starting from the beginning and I have to build myself around this particular event or this type of terrain.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, right. So obviously running is yours, especially. So let's talk about, how you got into the running, or is it, maybe it's more than just running? You're an endurance athlete. I assume running seems like, from what I've researched on you, running is your main thing, right?
Yeah. It's basically running. I'll do some kind of like supplementary activities like strength and mobility type things, but the main objective is trying to get fast at the longer stuff. I like ultra marathon, which is technically anything from 50 kilometers and above. And when I say above, there's some crazy big races out there that go like weeks and weeks. Usually they're not quite that long, but you can certainly find those if you're looking for that sort of stuff. A lot of people in the United States like the 100-mile distance. It's one that gets quite a bit of attention around the North America kind of running or ultra running circuit. But then again, that's got a lot of variety in it too. It's mountains and trails as well as flat stuff, tracks and all that as well. I got into running really early. We would do the Presidential Physical Fitness Challenge when I was in middle school, and one of the components to that was the mile run. And I realized after doing that, I was halfway decent at it, and I was probably the only kid in the class that actually liked it. So that was kind of a sign to me that was something to focus on. So I didn't take it overly seriously though until probably late high school, early college, which I look at in hindsight as kind of a good thing because it allowed me to try other sports too and maybe like kind of develop in a way that was maybe a little more well-rounded. And it also kind of kept me from maybe burning out on it early by taking it overly seriously while I was young at the expense of other opportunities too. But by the time I got to college and started to really dive into just like the methodology of how to train for specific events and specific distances and things like that, that's when I really kind of gravitated towards making that a really big piece of my year-round life, I guess, and focused on getting better at it and really understanding how and why.
Those are great. Thank you for saying that. I think a lot of people think like, well, if I'm going to be a world record holder, or if I'm going to be an elite athlete, I need to start basically from the crib and be training from day one and, have like one of these like Tiger Woods type stats,
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the case. And arguments can probably be made for both sides. But I think in general, for the mental wellness, the mental side of it, it's a lot healthier to introduce, your kids to a wide variety of things, let them kind of explore and see what they like, what they don't like, versus just like, okay, they have an affinity. Oh, I see they're a good runner. Like, I want to make them a world record athlete at some point in their life, and then just focus on that. Cause I think that, sometimes the kid's not along for the journey and all of a sudden the thing they loved becomes a thing that they hate.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like you had a good experience in being able to sort of dabble and see what you liked, what you didn't, and then kind of came back to this and said, okay, I'm good at this. I enjoy this, and I'm going to do it for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the other side benefit to that too is just you get a better understanding, I think, of where your strengths and weaknesses actually are. And then some of that stuff that you learn from other sports or other activities do shine a light on like where those maybe would fall into even the specific sport that you're training for. So for me, for ultra marathons, a lot of times people think, okay, you're running very far, therefore you're going to be running very slow, so long and slow. And that's true, especially on race day. But there's still like a periodized schedule of training that I'll follow that introduces like short, fast intervals, like explosive type movements and things like that I'll be doing more so during either the off season or the early stages of my training, since they are less specific to the intensity that I'm going to do on race day. But knowing that how my body performs in those type of workouts is real valuable. And for me, like when I go into a phase of training where I'm going to be doing like short intervals or something that's higher intensity in order to raise the ceiling on my aerobic capacity, when I get around to kind of focusing on that, some of the stuff I learned from sports that had a lot of more of a component of that or useful information for me. Like I know that there's a line where I have to kind of be careful of not crossing over or I'll get injured. And then if I get injured, now I'm taking weeks of training off the table that I could be potentially using to make better gains towards the end goal there. So I think you just learn a lot more about your strengths and weaknesses and what you have to be mindful of when you're focusing on your primary event from doing other sports sometimes too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. So a couple of questions here. At what age did you start your endurance? You kind of answered that, but I guess what age did you really start taking this seriously and saying, okay, I'm all in?
Yeah, so by my senior year in high school, I started training year round. I was still training at what I consider a very low volume standpoint. I would maybe run 20 to 30 miles per week. And by the time I got into college, that's when I really started taking it seriously and really started trying to understand, well, why do we do this workout versus the other one? And how does this fit into the plan and all that other stuff? So by the time I got into college, I think I started out at maybe about 50 miles a week of training, plus the workouts that were specific for like 5K to 10K type distances. And just kind of worked on that stuff. I learned a lot about myself during that phase of my running where, I identified that of the workouts we would do on a almost weekly basis, the long run was my favorite. So then after college, I kind of started focusing more on developing that side of my fitness. And that kind of is what led me into ultra marathons eventually, was just that kind of interest in the longer stuff.
What is the longest run or endurance event you've ever done? Like, or most, and that and or most challenging, I guess I should say.
Yeah, so the furthest I've run is 125 miles or 200 kilometers in kind of one event. The most challenging, it's a good question. If we look at it just as the race itself, I would say probably I did an event last year. It was a 24-hour where you see how far you can get in 24 hours. And I had just a whole string of things go wrong. But I wanted to get the full experience of being out there for 24 hours. So I stayed out there and did a ton of walking and a ton of suffering. So that was a
What, did you get an injury? Did something happen?
It was kind of a cascade of things like that. I had like one thing kind of went wrong, and that kind of like caused me to favor the other side of my leg or my body a little bit, and then that kind of cascaded into other things going wrong. So yeah, I got to a point where I had like some kind of hip and ankle issues that were basically keeping me from running for the most part. So that was kind of a longer struggle. But those things are part of the sport. I think you learn a lot from those. And there's a kind of a topic in ultra running where they'll like kind of a never quit mentality versus a kind of like hang it up and try another day type of a mentality. And then, everywhere in between. And it's an interesting topic, but I do think there's times when it's valuable to kind of stick it out despite having a rough time and having very few goals, if any, left on the table. And then there's times where it makes sense to, maybe say this isn't going to work for me today and I'm going to cause way more long-term damage by staying out here, and it's going to take future opportunities off the table too. So sometimes I think that's like situational. For that particular event though, I wanted to get that full 24-hour experience. I didn't suspect that it was going to be something that would be like a long-term issue. It was my last race of the season as well, so I'd be heading into off season after that. So it was just the opportunity to kind of experience the event despite it being much less than what I was hoping for, was I think a worthwhile lesson to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And right, I mean, injuries kind of change the game. So I think what I'm hearing you say is, which I think is the right thing to do. You made a commitment to yourself to finish, to do this event, right? And so obviously you can't control an injury. You had an injury, you try to push through it. You realize at some point, like, okay, I can't run this whole thing, or, but rather than just quit, you stuck with it to get the full, at least I'm out here for the 24 hours and I'm experiencing and I'm keeping that commitment to myself. I think that's huge. And that's one of those things that just builds your integrity. It helps build your mindset. It helps you, improve your confidence and your ability to accomplish things. And, people don't realize when they quit things, or they let their fear or whatever it is kind of take over, how much that degrades their mindset, and they start becoming more of that victim versus an owner of their lives. So kudos to you.
Right on. I did another event too that was a little more successful, but probably equally as challenging for a variety of reasons. I did 100 miles on a treadmill in May of 2020, and that was just so much different than anything I've done because of the nature of being on a treadmill versus on a course or a track or a trail or something like that. And the interesting thing to me about that one was when you're out there running normally, you have this like level of control where even if you're running a very even split race or you're hitting like very even like mile splits or kilometer splits, you're still making these micro adjustments that kind of give you this sense of control. Whereas when you're on a treadmill, you are literally responding to the machine. So it's going to be the exact same thing every time. So like just psychologically, there was like this much bigger pull to want to stop for that one for whatever reason. And I thought that was like kind of an interesting experience that I had to like kind of learn on the fly more or less, like how to kind of process that, the psychological side of that particular event.
You know, the psychological sides of speaking of that, like how much of it is physical, like your abilities, and how much of it all is psychological? Curious to get your answer on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think a lot of the physical components are more heavily weighted into kind of just doing the proper preparation and training. So like if I get the right workouts in and the right training build up, physically, I should be able to accomplish the goal. And in the back of my mind from doing this, I'll kind of know where those are. So the mental part, I think, comes in much more powerfully on the day of the event itself, because ultimately there's going to be some things that happen that you didn't plan for or that you were hoping wouldn't happen, and you have to kind of respond to them. So then you need to put yourself in a position where you had this mistake or something that set you back a few minutes or however long. And it can be very easy to think about, well, if I hadn't made that mistake, I'd be this much further up. I wouldn't have to do this now. And you can start kind of spiraling into a negative feedback loop in your mind. And really, when those things happen, you almost have to look at them as like, it's a 100-mile race or whatever distance it happens to be. With that, there's going to come uncertainties. And when those do happen, I need to respond to them in the best way possible in the moment, and then start focusing on what's ahead versus like dwelling on what happened in the past. And it can be helpful to like recognize that other people are going to have those same situations. They may just not happen at the same time yours is. So if I have like a hurdle to get over like that, it's say at mile 35 of a 100-miler, and I lose some ground to someone I'm racing, or someone catches up to me or something like that, I could sit there and think, oh, that was a big mistake that might cost me the race. Or I can think, that was my moment where I needed to navigate something that was uncertain. They're going to have their moment at some point, and when they do, then maybe I'll catch up, or I'll make progress, or thinking of it in a more positive thing. So I think on the event itself, the mental component just becomes this battle of against yourself or your mind, of spinning things into a positive direction versus letting them spiral into a negative. And the longer you get out there, the more mental fatigue you get, and the more difficult it gets to kind of like push back those thoughts. So in the beginning of a race, you might easily just like push away any negative self-talk. But then as you get closer to the end, like mile 70 of a 100-mile, 80 of a 100-miler, it can be much more difficult to do that. So sometimes I think like really using both your training and just experience from other events to work on how you push through those mental blocks is where people make a lot of gains in the sport. And that's where that side of the sport, I think is really important.
That was an awesome answer. Because each sport has their own psychological battles, right? And they're all a bit different, but they're all the same in a way. And that you're going to be thrown obstacles and challenges, and to remind yourself that everybody else that you're competing against has those same obstacles and challenges. Maybe not the exact same ones as you, but they're going to have their own set. And that it's about figuring out how to maneuver, to pivot, to get through that temporary obstacle that's in between you and your goal. And knowing that if you're able to push through, and that there's these other people that, they're not as psychologically strong as you, may not be able to, that gives you a huge advantage. And that itself, it's like a momentum building energizer, I would think.
For sure. And then once you start kind of using those experiences in other areas of life, I think it really starts to show its value too, because you can translate that into just almost a standard work day too, where if I sit down and I know I've got like these 5 objectives to get done with stuff I'm doing outside of training and racing, and the third one on the list doesn't go according to plan, I could sit there and dwell on that for the rest of the day and then not even complete those final 2 things. Or I can say, okay, that didn't work out well. Maybe I have to go back to the drawing board and reinvent that. But now I need to move on to these other 2 things and make sure I, do a good job on those, and kind of making sure that you're learning from your mistakes when you have the opportunity to sit back and reflect on them, but also not letting those negatively impact other things that could go quite well if you're able to kind of recenter your mind.
Totally. I love that. Yeah, that was a good one. And so what's your diet chart, and do you have a cheat day? So yeah, what do you put into your body, and how does that go?
Yeah, so I follow, a lot of times people think of endurance athletes, they think like kind of like high carbohydrate diets, and that's probably what a majority of them are going to do, especially at the kind of standard distances. I'm focusing on much longer events where the intensities are going to be quite low relative to, say, like, if you watch the Olympics, which are just happening right now on the athletics and the track and field, and these folks running 5K, 10K at just like, mind-blowing paces. I'm running much slower because I'm running all day. So I find it much more valuable for me to focus on improving my body's ability to metabolize fat at a very high rate compared to carbohydrates, so that I am not tapping into my muscle glycogen as quickly at a given intensity. And the way you can manipulate that by the way you train, but you can manipulate it in a much larger way by what you eat. So in order for me to do that, I tend to follow a lower carbohydrate diet, higher amounts of fat, moderate amounts of protein. It's not a no carbohydrate diet. So I'll still have carbohydrates. I'll strategically use them throughout training, like especially if I'm doing like short intervals or some like slightly higher intensity type things in my workouts and stuff like that. But I'm very much going to be kind of, for the easy way for people to understand, if you think of kind of like a standard diet, that would probably be around, 15% protein, maybe 20% fat, and then 65% carbohydrate or somewhere around there. My carbohydrates and fats are kind of flipped on their head for the most part, where I'm going to be eating like 65% fat and maybe only, 15% to 20% carbohydrate on like a big training block. So the foods that make that up is I try to get a lot of like kind of high quality protein sources that happen to usually have quite a bit of fat along with them. So a lot of eggs, full fat dairies, fatty cuts of meat and things like that, fish, extra virgin olive oils, avocados, seeds and nuts. Those sort of things make up a pretty big, eggs make up a pretty big like portion of my diet on the day to day. And then when I do bring back some of the carbohydrates, I'll usually focus on things like, fruits, melons, berries, some like starchier like tubers like potatoes and that sort of stuff. Maybe some sourdough bread. My wife's a big sourdough bread fan, so we usually have that around. So I'll sometimes have that when I'm bringing back a little bit of the carbohydrate. Yeah, so that's kind of my go-to. In terms of cheat meals, I don't necessarily plan them. I don't say like, every 7th day I'm just going to go eat whatever I want. But what I do is I don't like over stress situations that put me in a position where that may happen. So like if I go out with a group of friends and, they decide we're going to an Italian restaurant or something like that, I'm not gonna say, hey guys, have fun in there. I'm going over to the Brazilian steakhouse next door.
Right.
I'll go in there and I'll just say, okay, today I wasn't quite dialed in with what, I was planning originally maybe, but I can easily account for that by just, controlling the diet, the way I eat the next couple of days. So it's usually when you look at it like in a 3-day window or a 6-day window versus a 1-day window, and you can usually make it all square by the end of it all.
I think that's a good way to look at it. Again, it's a kind of, to me, that's like a friction reducer versus, trying to willpower, like, oh, I can't touch any of this food until the 7th day, versus like, as long as you're eating, and another guest I had put it in a good way. It was like 80% of what you eat is good, then you should be good, And so it's like, right, as long as the majority is good, and once in a while you want this ice cream or you want, whatever, it's like, okay, like as long as for the majority, you just got to be careful. It's a slippery slope, right? And you got to make sure that 80% is met.
Yeah, and that's perfect. And that's just, that's like allowing life to happen. And that's also like what we were kind of talking about with the training in the beginning. It makes it a little more sustainable when you don't feel like, oh, I'm giving this up forever. I feel like anytime you tell someone you can never do that, that's a guarantee that they're going to try to do it at some point. So you got to be careful with the absolutes.
Exactly right. Absolutes are dangerous in my opinion. Right. It's a flexible world. It's a flexible you got to kind of go with the flows. So okay, so I know you came on a little bit late. We got to wrap up here soon, but I like to kind of end and ask, what do you is there a particular habit that you've developed that you feel has really helped you to get to where you are? Maybe it used to be a failure habit when you were younger and it's turned into a success habit, but something that you have, for instance, one of the things I would already point out, so you can't use this one because you already used it, is your mindset in terms of like when the day of the race and the obstacles that come up and just being able to like figure out a way to push through, knowing everybody's kind of going through the same thing and you're going to get through it. So that's an example. Is there something else that you feel like you have that really helps separate you and has helped you get to where you are?
Yeah, and I would say this is something I put into practice across the board, not just with the running. It's what I learned it from running for sure, but it is just kind of having tiered goals where it's very easy, I think, to say, okay, that's the race I want in 4 months to do really well at, and make that your goal, and just try to keep that stoke or that energy high throughout that 4 month build up. Or maybe it's a big project or something I'm working on for coaching, and it's like it's gonna take me 4 months to finish it. Those end goals are great, especially to get you started and get you motivated and kind of keep you relatively excited through the process. But one thing I kind of learned early is if that's your only goal through the process, your motivation is going to start out very high and it's going to start tapering down and tapering down. And if you don't have, like a tiered goal approach, then by the time you get to the event, you may not be nearly as excited about it as you were when you first started. So what I try to do is I try to look at like daily, weekly, like training block and end goal as kind of like the tiers, so that when I need to draw some really quick, immediate motivation, I can look at my daily goal and say, okay, this is what I'm trying to accomplish today. Let's go get that done, because I know when I get it done and finish it, I'm going to feel good about it. I'm going to feel good that I accomplished something, and that may position me to have a successful rest of the day. And then I have kind of like the weekly goals too, where if I'm not looking for that immediate, like in the moment type of goal, it's like, well, what do I actually want to accomplish today with my workouts and things? Like, what are the 3 things that need to happen regardless of whether I do them today or tomorrow? And then you just kind of keep moving up the chain. So you always have like these short-term as well as long-term focus points. And when you kind of blend them all together, I think that gives you a more even, consistent level of motivation across the board. Then when you get to the race itself or the project itself, you can look back at that stuff and see all those check marks you put on that schedule that you got. And that's what gives you the confidence, I think, to believe you're going to be able to do what you set out to do when you say, okay, I've had all these small wins along the way.
Yeah.
The training, the work, it's there. Now I just need to go further and execute on what I like to look at as the final piece of the puzzle, even if it's a really long race, which can be kind of overwhelming when you look at it on paper. When you look at it in the lens of, this took me 4 months to build up to, this is the last 1% versus I need to run 100 miles today or something like that.
It was all very good information. Somebody's got a question, but I think we're kind of out of time here, so maybe we'll have you on again. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Zach, for being on the show and taking the time. You're in an airport, you're moving around. Thanks for being with us and sharing, dropping some wisdom, and keep doing what you're doing, man. It's as I said, something I'm not one of my strengths, so I'm always impressed. And when I see people that have this ability to do things easily, that there's a huge struggle for me.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me on anytime, and apologize for kind of throwing a wrench into the order of operations here today.
Oh, no problem. What is success to you? I do like that question. So why don't we end it on that?
Yeah, that's great. I think this is something that's probably evolved for me over the course of my career a bit. Like early on, I think success was like a little more myopic, where it was like a good end result. Like if I, win a race or run a faster time than I did the time before, is where my mind would typically go. But as I kind of have gone and progressed through the sport, I've learned that you can learn so much about yourself. And sometimes you can learn about things that are like at the moment are like a 1 step back, but ultimately 2 steps forward. So things like injuries, bad races, and stuff like that, if you look at it through like the lens of, well, what can I pull from that worked and didn't work, and then go back to the drawing board and build it differently, I think you find yourself at a better end product from a career standpoint than you would by looking at it as just, this was a good race or a bad race. The good ones I'm going to be happy about, the bad ones I'm going to be mad about, and then kind of go back and do it again. I think you find yourself making mistakes over again and being less successful over the course of years if you go that way. So I think success is defined by your ability to learn from your mistakes and then actually put something into action to remedy them so they don't continually happen or become kind of a mainstay.
Love it. Yeah. And that ties to this universal principle I talk about all the time, universal principle. And we kind of talked about it briefly earlier, where it's like, it goes into your mindset of like how you handle failures and obstacles, and versus like the victim going, oh, I knew I couldn't do it. Like, I knew this was too hard. Like, why am I even bothering? Versus, all right, that sucked. It didn't feel good. What did I learn? How can I reset so that I become bigger, better, faster, stronger, smarter moving forward?
Perfect. Yeah. Love it.
So thank you for that, man. All right. Well, great chatting with you, brother. And let's keep in touch. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for checking it out.
That's it for the 5 Core Life. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button on this video and pound that subscribe button so you get notified when new episodes drop. Also, please fill out the free 5 Core Life Evaluator quiz. It's a great way to get a baseline of where you are in the 5 cores and which of the 5 cores you need support. In addition, you'll get some actionable advice that you can apply and start improving your life in the areas that you need it most. That's it for today's episode of the 5 Core Life Podcast. Have a wonderful day.
Get moving. Gain momentum. Join the movement. Join Emmett by going to moremomentum.com to take a free life evaluator quiz on where you currently stand in each of your 5 cores.